Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Webinar Wednesday. Hello, Shep. Just some quick housekeeping. We do have people that join us from rural areas with poor internet connection, so if you can, please turn off your screen for your video. It does help us share this to other areas that have less stable internet connection. And we also see that you've joined the meeting muted. We do ask you to stay on mute during the presentation. We'll have time for questions at the end, and feel free to type those into the chat as we go if you have a question. I'll relay them to the speakers. Also, if you have anyone that wants to see these presentations that's been unable to join us today, we will be recording it and offering it for later viewing. I generally have those up by the end of the day. If not, it will be up by the end of the week. And do please fill out the post-completion survey, and I'll throw that into the chat right now. If you need Master Dairy credit for this meeting, we love that everyone is here. We want to make sure everybody gets credit, but I don't always know who iPhone or random assortment of numbers is. So if you need Master credit for this meeting, please fill out the post-completion survey, and that's going to be at the word tiny, tiny.utk.edu/WW2021. And please fill that out at the end of the day, and we'll make sure you get credit for being here. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the day. This is Ms. Caitlin Zering. She is a master's student in my group working with value-added dairy producers across the state of Tennessee and putting together some resources. And Caitlin, anything else you want to share about you?
It's not really a whole lot. My project works with value-added dairies. I work with surveying dairy farmers or dairy enterprise owners who are considering or are currently taking local Tennessee milk, usually their own, and turning it into another product, i.e. the cheese today, but it can be any kind of product, butter, bottled milk, anything like that. But again, we're going to be focusing on cheese today. I also do work with our consumers to figure out what consumers want to see in a value-added product. And then I'm working on an interactive decision tool to hopefully give our farmers an idea of what it might cost them to start bottling their own milk. And that's pretty much what my project is right now. All right, so I can go ahead and get started. I'm gonna mute or change some stuff on my screen for a second. And I'm going to also turn my video off just to make sure that we can stream it to everyone who might not have as good of internet connection. All right. Okay. So can you guys type in the chat if you can still hear me? Yes, no? Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, guys. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So like I said, I am working today on, I'll be talking to you guys today about Cheesemaking 101, the classification and common steps. And well, there we go. Okay. So to start, let's talk a little bit about the history of cheese. So that really begins with when our dairy animals were first domesticated. And this was between 11,000 and 10,500 years ago. So more than a couple years ago. But our first true evidence of cheese being made came from pot shards of what turns out to be sieves, which was used to separate the curds from the whey. That was about 7,000 years ago in 5000 BC. But our first written account of cheese didn't come until Uruk, Mesopotamia, which was 5,500 years ago. So as you can see, cheese has been around for quite a long time. And then as we go through the presentation, the one that I'm going to keep going back to is going to be our cheddar cheeses, because this is the United States' most common cheese. And it happens to be what most of our processors in our area are considering making. So I will go back and forth between just general cheese processing steps, but then I'll be relating it a lot back to our cheddars. So there's many ways to classify our cheeses, but the first is texture. And we have two types of textures for this. We have a closed and an open texture. Our closed texture is going to be our cheddars and our parmesans, which you can see a photo of both on the left side of the screen. And our open texture, there's two types of this. There's our round eye cheeses, which those little circles are caused by carbon dioxide buildup within that cheese while it's being produced. And eventually that'll turn into these little holes that you see, or these round eyes. And then the other one is going to be our mechanical holes, which is used by taking rods and inserting rods into that cheese to help get oxygen in there. And those mechanical holes are going to be seen in our Tilsits and Havardis, whereas the round eyes is going to be seen in our Swisses, Emmentals, and small round eyes will be seen in our Goudas as well. The second way is going to be curing. And there's many different types of curing. There's a lot on this slide, but we're going to walk through each of the groupings. So there's three different types of ways to classify curing cheeses. So there is our bacteria cured or ripened, and ripened and cured are used interchangeably, but throughout the presentation, I'm going to refer to it as cured. So our bacteria cured, we have internal and external. Our internal bacteria cured cheeses are going to be our cheddars, Swisses, Goudas, hard mozzarellas, and parmesans. Our bacteria cured externally are going to be our Limburger, our Gruyères, and our Tilsits. These are known as more of our stronger scent cheeses. And just a fun fact, you actually can't take Limburger cheese on public transportation due to its strong stench in Europe. So our second one is going to be our mold cured cheeses. And I actually didn't say this on the last slide, but our bacteria cured cheeses, most of them are not going to be pasteurized, but our mold cured cheeses, some may be pasteurized and others may not. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about what qualifies something to be pasteurized and when that needs to be done. But our mold cured cheeses have also internal and external. Our internal is going to be our Gorgonzolas and our Stiltons, which are all classified as blue cheeses. And our external cheeses, our external mold cured cheeses are going to be our Bries and our Camemberts. And then our uncured or fresh cheeses are going to be pasteurized always, because these are not going to sit for a lengthy period of time. These, once they're produced, they're ready to go. There's no aging process. So to make sure that they're safe for consumption, we have to pasteurize the milk for this. And there's four types of our uncured or fresh cheeses. We have acid, which is going to be where no rennet and no heat are added, but you're adding some kind of acid, which could be something like lactic acid, acetic acid, or vinegar. And these are going to be our cottage cheeses, cream cheeses, quarks, and chèvres. Our acid plus heat are going to be our panniers, our mascarpone, and our ricottas. And another fun fact, our panniers are going to be the cheese that we have today that's most similar to the first cheeses that were produced by man. Then we have our acid and rennet cheeses, which are going to mainly be our fresh mozzarella. And then finally is our rennet fresh cheeses, which are going to be our panellas, our rancheros, and queso frescos. The next way that we can classify cheese is through moisture content. And this is going to be categorized from soft to extra hard. And we'll start with our extra hard and go down. This one's going to be a moisture content of less than 41%. And these are going to be our Parmesans, Asiagos, Manchegos, and Cotijas. Our hard is going to be the next step down, which is going to be 49 to 56% moisture. And this is going to constitute our cheddars, Emmentals, Swisses, and Gruyères. Then we get into our semi-hard, which is 54 to 63% moisture, which will be, again, our cheddars, blue cheeses, Goudas, Havardis, and Tilsits. And then we go down to our semi-soft, which we're getting into our higher moisture contents at 61 to 69%. And again, we're going to see our blue cheeses, our Bries, Fontinas, Limburger, and Munsters. And then our final one is going to be our soft cheeses, which are going to be greater than 67% moisture. And these are going to be our cottage cheeses, cream cheeses, and fresh mozzarella's. And now the thing I want to point out on this one is that you can see these categories have overlapping moisture contents. So for our semi-hard, we have 54 to 63, and our hard is 49 to 56%. So there is a little bit there, which is why we can see the cheddars in both of those. And the same goes for our soft and semi-soft. The reasoning for this is just because typically our aging, you can age cheeses longer, get different texture or get different moisture contents in them and process them differently for that different moisture content. So you could have a harder cheddar or a softer cheddar based on that moisture content. Our final way to classify cheese is going to be through age. And this is going to be what I spoke about a second ago, which is going to be how long has it been aged? Our young Goudas versus our aged Goudas are going to be one example, but the most common that we think of is going to be our cheddars. So our young Goudas versus aged Goudas, our young is going to be about 4 weeks to 9 months old, whereas our aged Goudas are going to be 9 months to 2 years old. And then just something to note before we go on, I've said it multiple times, but getting into that pasteurization, anything that is aged less than 60 days must be pasteurized. This is by law, you cannot deviate from this. This is just for the safety of everyone consuming the cheese. So going into cheddars, and like I said earlier, cheddars is our most numerous type of cheese and most common cheese that we see around here. So what we're going to do is stick with this. So we have multiple different types of cheeses and of cheddars, and you can see they go from mild to extra sharp. And this just depends on how many months they've been aged. But the one in the center, which is one I want to point out, this is not a USDA standard, this super sharp. This is a marketing strategy. So USDA has standards for mild, medium, sharp, and extra sharp, but they don't have, there's nothing beyond that. So this is going to be a marketing strategy for this Nasonville dairy or whatever dairy that is producing or processing this cheese. You can have it's sometimes called a reserve cheddar as well. So our general processing steps. This is just kind of a short map, and we're not going to talk a whole lot because we're going to go into detail, but you'll see that our basic map can be altered based on the type of cheese that we want. Steps can be rotated, steps can be done differently, and steps can be added or removed. So our first step, pre-treatment, this one, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on because it's something that's often cost prohibitive to some of our smaller operations because of the equipment that's needed for it. But you can reduce the spore count or the bacteria that can produce spores in the milk through bactifugation, which is using a separator to separate out that skim milk with the bacteria. And then often you're going to pasteurize that and then add it back in. Or you could do microfiltration to go ahead, you separate out the milk, the cream and the skim, you run the skim through a filter. That way you avoid capturing all the fat molecules. And then again, you go through and separate and pasteurize it again, or separate and standardize it. And it's often pasteurized. The other way is through pathogen reduction, which can be our pasteurization like I've talked about, or our thermatization. And this thermatization is essentially so you can hold milk longer. It's going to be used with something like an HTST system. So this is also pretty cost prohibitive for most operations. And just again, because I want to drill this into you guys, anything aged less than 60 days, less than 2 months must be pasteurized. So our step 2 is going to be our additives and ripening of the cheese or of the milk for the cheese. So for this, we're going to add our milk into a vat, increase that heat to 86 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit, and add in our lactic acid starter culture. This is typically a single strain starter culture for cheese or for cheddars. It's going to be a non-gas producing. But the purpose of adding this in is to help expel whey, degrade some of the protein, release salt, calcium, and phosphorus to help create a firmer curd and to suppress that bacteria growth. If we need to, we can add things like calcium chloride to help increase that calcium content, our colorants, which is often for cheddars and natto bean extract, and then adjunct cultures, which can be used to shorten ripening time or to help if you are creating some kind of reduced fat cheese or if you want to enhance the flavor. Once all this stuff is added, we let it sit for 30 to 60 minutes. Once we've let it sit, we're going to add in our rennet and let it sit for another about 30 minutes. But we're going to increase the temp to 95 degrees Fahrenheit this time. And this ratio down here, 1 to 10 to 1 to 15, is our rennet to milk ratio specifically for cheddars. This ratio can vary based on what cheese you're making. The purpose of this rennet is to promote that coagulation to make it all clump together. And once it's sat for about 30 minutes, then we can move into what's called a curd test to see if we can cut that curd and the coagulum into curds. And we can see that here. So our curd test, what you want to do is you want to take a knife and plunge it into that coagulum and you want to pull it out. And what you're looking for is thinking like you're testing a cake or cookies. When you put that toothpick in and pull it out, you don't really want to see anything on that toothpick. That means that it's done. That's the same concept with our coagulum. If it comes out and has this clean break like we see on the right, that means that we're good to go. We can cut the curd or we can cut the coagulum into curds. But if we get something like this middle photo here where you see a shattering effect, there's a couple things you want to look for. First thing you're going to do is wait, because this means that your coagulum, for whatever reason, is weak. Now, typically what we can do is just let it sit for a little bit longer and it should resolve itself. But if this continues to be an issue throughout and over multiple batches, one thing you might look at is seeing what content of calcium you have in your milk. And if you're low on your calcium, maybe you want to start either adding for a temporary fix, adding that calcium chloride in, or going back on farm and figuring out how we can increase that calcium content. So once we passed our curd test, we can take one of these cheese knives that you see here and go through, put it down into our coagulum and pull it so that way we are cutting that curd. For hard cheeses like cheddar, we want those curd sizes to be between 4 and 6 millimeters. And this size of the curd is going to help us determine what type of moisture or what amount of moisture we're going to have in our cheese. After our curds have been cut, then we're going to go into syneresis, which is whey expulsion. And what that's going to do is we're going to mechanically stir those curds as well as slowly apply heat to them to help get rid of that whey and help the curds expel that whey. We're going to gently heat until we get up to about 100 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we're going to what's called scald it at that temperature for 20 minutes. And that's going to be done between 1 and 3 times, depending on how much whey we need to expel. By the end of this, our cheese curd should be around 5.4 pH level. So here's where we're going to deviate from our general stuff for cheddars. So cheddars, we followed all the main steps so far, but now we're going to add a cheddaring step. Because we need cheddars to have a lower pH, we're going to leave those curds to sit until that pH does drop from that 4.4, where it should be at, down to, 5.4, down to that 5.2 or 5.25. For controlling that moisture content. Now, once we've got that pH level down to that 5.2 to 5.25, then we're going to use a miller like we see here. This one is a hand crank miller, and crank it up and turn those curds into milled chunks of 0.75 by 0.75 by 3 inches. Now, from there, from the cheddar side, we're going to move on to salting. But because the salting, I talk about a bunch of different types of salting, we're going to talk about molding first. So if you were to do cheddars, you would do that cheddaring, milling, salting, and then molding. But for most other cheeses, we're going to go in from that centeresis to placing those curds into molds like you see here, into salting. So for our salting, we want that pH of 0.2 to 5.2 to 5.6. That 5.2 is really our lowest that we want to be, with 5.6 being the highest we want before we salt. Anything lower than that, we can have really brittle cheeses that can break apart, or we can have anything higher, we can have cheeses that lose their shape. So for our dry salting, we have dry salting and then we have brine salting. Our dry salting we're going to talk about first. This is for cheddars, Swisses, Bries, Monterey's, and Colby's. So our wheels, which is going to be, again, our Swisses, our Bries, and then some Limburg cheeses and some blue cheeses. You're going to mold those cheeses, and then you're going to take them out of the mold, set the wheels down, and you're going to rub it in salt. But for our cheddars and our Colby's, things that we're milling, we're going to add that salt directly into those chips and then mix it up. Or we can do what's called a brining for this salting step. Now, the brine is a little bit more intensive. What we want to do is we can have a shallow brining or a deep brining. Our deep brining is going to be more seen in our larger facilities. Shallow brining is going to be more our farmstead processing facilities. And you're going to want to, when you have the shallow brining, you don't want any of the cheese to get dry. So you're going to be constantly rotating that cheese. So it is a little bit work intensive. This is going to be more for our Goudas, Gruyères, cheeses like this. But our brining, we have to be very careful with how we do this. So the brining has a certain amount of concentration of salt, between 18 and 23%, and that brine itself has to stay between 50 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. So typically we just leave it in a little bit of a cooler room while we're doing it. Our length of time for brining depends on the amount of salt the cheese needs, our size of the cheese itself, and then the temperature of that brining solution. So once we've brined it, now we get to move into our final pressing. And this can be done through a continuous press or a stacked mold, which isn't as common. Our continuous press is what we're really going to talk about. This one, you're going to put those cheeses back into molds, and then you're going to put them in this press and crank it down. And this can be for about 18 hours that you're pressing it. So you're going to leave it and then come back to it later. This isn't something that you're going to be pressing for a little bit and then you can move on. So this is a pretty long step. But once we've pressed our cheeses, then we're going to go into our aging and ripening. And the first step for this is to cover our cheeses. So once we've pressed our cheeses and with that continuous press system, we've taken them out of the press, we're going to remove them from the molds, and then we're going to cover them with some kind of rind. And this rind is to prevent water and oxygen from contaminating the cheese, causing it to mold or to even dry out. So we have two types. We have our inedible rinds and our edible rinds. Our inedible rinds are going to be our waxes, leaves of some kind, or cloth. Our waxes are going to be for our Goudas and cheddars. Then we have leaves, which this is going to be more for our specialty cheeses. There's a couple of processors in Tennessee that do use our leaves on their cheeses, but these are very specific cheeses to them that they choose. But then we also have cloth, which is going to be used for our paneer, queso blanco, and quark. And these are, like I said, inedible. These are not things that you eat. You would cut them off before. But we have edible rinds as well, which these are rinds that you can eat. These can be consumed, but a lot of people don't eat them. But that doesn't mean that you can't. So the first type here is going to be our bloomy rinds, which are going to be our Bries and Camemberts. These are going to be covered with edible mold spores, and then they're going to be brushed and fed and then left alone until that mold can bloom. And it's going to be an often white, soft, and fuzzy feel to it. But again, just to point out, because I know for some people that may not be appetizing, this is a edible and safe cheese or bacteria that you can eat. And then for our next one, we have our washed rind cheeses. And this one you can see here has an orange or a reddish color to it. And this is going to be cheeses that are set in an environment for a couple weeks and then literally washed over and over with a brine or an alcohol to create a damp environment for mold to grow. This is going to be what we talked about earlier, those strong smelling cheeses that may have a salty flavor. This is going to be our Gruyères, our Epoisses, and our Limburgs as well. And then finally, we have our natural rind cheeses. And this is most commonly our Parmesan Reggiano cheeses. This is going to be cheese that is left in the wheel, set out, and then periodically rubbed with oil, salt, or a damp cloth soaked in brine until that outer layer of the cheese thickens and hardens. So it is still edible, but it's often going to be a gritty texture to it. Once we've added whatever rind that you choose to add to it, then we're going to place it into a green room, a fermenting room, and or an aging room. And each of these are different types of rooms, but a lot of people just call them the same thing. Now, after we've placed them in the room, we're going to leave them for however long we need. For our cheddars, it's going to be greater than 60 days. Our washed rind cheeses, there's a huge range of time. The same with our Swisses and Alpine cheeses. And these do vary based on what type of cheese. So these are just some examples of it. Our cheddars, there are certain temperatures and humidities that all of these cheeses have to be kept at. So we have our cheddars at 39 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit at a relative humidity of less than 80%. So that room's humidity needs to be less than 80% for 60 days or more. And again, the cheddars is because that 60 days is because it's typically not pasteurized. And our Swisses and Alpines, our washed rind cheeses, and our other hard cheeses, these ones are going to be a little bit more intensive because we have several steps that we need to go through. Whereas the cheddars, we set them in an aging room and we leave them. These they're going to go through that green room where they're at a really high humidity. And then they're going to drop down to often a fermenting room, a little bit less humidity, but a little bit higher temp. And then they're going to go back to that aging room. And then just to close out, what the main things I want you to take from this are that there are different types of classifications for cheeses, and different cheeses can be classified in each of these categories. So they can be classified based on texture, curing, moisture, and age. Our general processing steps are going to be the same no matter what, but they are going to vary. You're going to have the same steps, but they're going to vary. And then the final thing, and one of the most important, is that cheesemaking equipment is not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. But just because you buy something to produce a cheddar cheese doesn't mean that you can't use it to make a blue cheese or a Emmental. So this equipment can be used. You just have to make sure that you're cleaning it, taking care of your equipment, just the basic stuff. Got to take care of your equipment, and then make sure that you understand how these steps work. So with that, thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Leave yours on, and theoretically they should be able to hear me.
Okay, maybe.
Well, in theory, I can't hear you because my video is muted. But thanks, that was a great job. I learned a lot about cheeses in general. You did mention something about using the same equipment for multiple types of cheeses, and you said blue cheese specifically. Are there any things that we need to think about with some of those mold cheeses if we are doing multiple types of cheeses at the same time?
Yeah, so the main thing that you're going to be thinking about if you're going to be switching from one cheese from like a bacteria cheese to a mold type cheese is really going to be that culture itself and the way that you're brining it. Those are going to be your main two things, and where you store it. So with our mold type cheeses, typically they're going to be stored on a pallet, and then they're going to have a plastic over it to help control that humidity and moisture. Whereas something like your cheddar may or may not have that plastic over it to help control better. But you want to make sure that you are cleaning all your equipment, you don't want to go through with your cheese vat, add in your culture and for your cheddars, and then take everything out, move it on to the next step, and then throw something for a blue cheese with a blue cheese culture in it without cleaning it. Because then you're going to get a mixture of that culture and you're not going to have a successful blue cheese.
We do have a question online that says, do you see many caves being used for aging in Tennessee by cheesemakers? That is a great question, Sarah. We do see I know of one that is actually using a true cave for a cheese cave experience. And there's probably some others that have created an artificial cave. But yes, I do know of one that does do aging in a cave with it's goat milk cheeses, I believe. But the majority of our cheeses in Tennessee are cheddars, so no cave aging.
There is actually a second one as well. So to my knowledge, there is two so far that do it. One that does it with cow milk, and then one that does it with goat milk as well.
This next question is, on-farm cheese making a growing industry in the state, particularly as getting set up and licensing is expensive, as is marketing and moving enough product to be a viable farm business. Those are all excellent points, Billy. And even with that, we have a lot of interest in cheese making and farmstead processing across the state and across all of the species. So we have quite a few cow dairies that are interested in it. We have some goat dairies and some sheep dairies that are all either involved or are looking at becoming involved in this process. And we have some great partners at TDA, and I believe they're still on here. Let me see. Yep, at least one of them is still on here, that works very closely with our dairy population to try to streamline the licensing and permitting process more from a making sure everybody knows what's expected and keeping everybody on the same page early on. And we have a lot of resources here at UT and with our partner institutions at North Carolina and Kentucky to try to help provide extra support as well. So if any of your farmers are interested in it, Billy, definitely reach out and we'll come out and visit.
There is actually one more question that's right above Billy's. It's, do the dry salt chips alter the taste of the cheese a lot or not much at all? So it doesn't really alter the taste, but what it does is it allows you to have a higher content of salt in that cheese. So our dry salting, because you're adding it directly and you're not having that salt infuse in through a brine, you can get a lot higher salt concentration, which is what you want for something like our cheddars.
These are great questions. Keep them coming, y'all. We like the question part. Trying to think of more questions while we're waiting for more activity in the chat. And if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, that's also fine here at the end. That's great. Kind of want to revisit Billy's question about opportunities for support. And for those of you who haven't heard about it yet, Tennessee, in partnership with University of Kentucky, North Carolina State University, we provide some grant support for value-added dairy businesses. And one of the unique things about our grants is we can help fund equipment purchases. So like Caitlin mentioned earlier, equipment is very expensive. Now, we can't promise that you're going to get a permit. We can't promise that you're actually going to be successful in your grant application. We can help look at it. We can help guide you in the right direction. But that is a unique opportunity that we have here at Tennessee and in Kentucky, North Carolina, is to try to provide some financial support to offset that high startup cost associated with value added. We also work really closely with some of our partners over in the Ag Econ department here at UT, I guess it's AREC. I always forget that there's another letter in there, but we work very closely with them, trying to help evaluate financial health before starting one of these businesses and continued financial health after starting one of these businesses. So please do, if you have any questions about it at all, reach out to us and we'll be happy to direct you to the appropriate team member.
And just as a point to add on to that, if you guys are considering going into this and you're at the stage where you're considering equipment, do reach out to us because we have contacts with a couple of our processing equipment companies, and we can look to help point you in the right direction and give you contact information to see if there's anything that these companies themselves can do. I know a lot of our producers that are already processing, they've bought used equipment, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. But we have had a couple say that, maybe we should have got used or we should have got new equipment. So if you're thinking about new equipment or you want to know the pros and cons of it, please reach out to us and we're more than happy to help you with it.
Chat is still quiet. Makes it hard to answer questions that aren't in the chat.
I guess I did such a great job that no one has any questions at all.
Obvious. Totally what it is. Well, we're not going to keep all of you on here just for fun moving forward. So while I give everybody a chance to type now or forever hold their peace, I'm going to throw in the post-completion survey one more time. And again, if any of you are, I see that there's something in the chat. I'm going to look at it in just a second. If any of you need Master Dairy credit or just want to tell us what you liked about the presentation, what you wanted to learn more about, or if you want more topics like this in the future, please do go listed. Oh, and apparently it did make it the post evaluation link. Thanks, Ranson. It helps if I add it on there before I send the link out. I'll get it fixed momentarily. So don't do it yet. Do it in like 10 minutes and it'll be fixed. But make sure you go there and give us some feedback on this presentation and make sure we get you logged on.
Thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate you guys coming out and hearing me ramble about cheeses.
It was an educational ramble.
It was an educational ramble, so it's fine.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday and happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you.